Southern Russia, March 1943. A German field marshal leans over a map table, and something impossible is unfolding. Only weeks earlier, his armies had been reeling. The catastrophe at Stalingrad had just torn a gaping hole in the entire German front. The Red Army was pouring through it, sensing the smell of final victory. By every rule of war, the German forces in the south should have been annihilated. Instead, this one man turned and struck back, outnumbered by as much as 3-1. He let the enemy overreach, then slashed into their flank with concentrated armor. In a matter of weeks, he shattered 3 Soviet armies and sent the rest into headlong retreat. He retook the great city of Kharkov and stabilized a front the whole world had already written off. To this day, they still teach this counterattack at war colleges from West Point to Sandhurst. It was the work of, quite possibly, the finest military mind of the entire Second World War. His name was Erich von Manstein, and within a single year, this man would be stripped of his command and sent home in disgrace, never to lead an army again. He would be beaten, but not by the Russians in front of him. He would be beaten by the man standing behind him, his own Führer. This is the story of the 2 greatest commanders on the Eastern Front, the German artist and the Soviet force of nature who finally stopped him. History says the Russian was the better general, because the Russian won, but the truth is far stranger, because their duel was never decided by which man was the better soldier at all. It was decided by which one of them was allowed to fight. To understand that, we have to go back to the beginning. Erich von Manstein was born in 1887. Into the very heart of the Prussian military aristocracy, soldiering was not a career for his family. It was a birthright, running back through generations of officers and generals. By training, he was a staff officer, cool, precise, endlessly analytical. Through his family, he was even distantly linked to Germany's old warrior president. Hindenburg soldiering ran in his very blood. He had been born, in fact, under a different name, von Lewinsky, and given away as an infant to be raised by relatives, the von Mansteins. In an old Prussian custom, generals filled his bloodline on every side. He came of age in the trenches of the First World War and emerged a rising star of the German general staff. In the lean years between the wars, while a defeated Germany rebuilt its shattered army in secret, Manstein made his name as one of its sharpest planning minds. By the time Hitler came to power and began preparing for a new war, few officers were more respected inside the German high command. Above all, he was blessed with a gift that set him apart from almost everyone around him. Manstein could look at a map and see, as if by instinct, the one move his enemy would never expect. He was a disciple of maneuver, of speed, of surprise, of striking the enemy where he was weakest rather than grinding him down by brute force. It was an approach that demanded boldness from a commander and freedom from his masters. Hold that thought. In 1940, that gift would change the course of history. When Hitler turned west to attack France, the German high command drew up a cautious plan. It was a slow, obvious thrust through Belgium, very nearly a replay of the last war. Manstein looked at it and saw a recipe for stalemate and slaughter. Germany's generals were haunted by the last war, when an attack in the west had bogged down into 4 endless years of trench slaughter. The cautious plan risked repeating that exact nightmare. Manstein was serving as chief of staff to one of the army groups poised to invade close enough to the plan to see its flaws, and bold enough to try to change it. So he proposed something audacious, something that bordered on reckless. Send the main weight of Germany's panzers not across the open plains of Belgium, but straight through the Ardennes. The Ardennes was a dense, hilly forest that every expert agreed was impassable to tanks. That was the precise reason Manstein chose it. An enemy will never defend a door he believes cannot be opened. To be certain it could work, Manstein turned to Germany's foremost tank expert, Heinz Guderian, who studied the forest roads and told him the panzers could indeed get through. Armed with that, Manstein bombarded the high command with memorandum after memorandum, pressing his case without mercy. His superiors thought him brilliant, but arrogant and exhausting, and to be rid of him, they packed him off to command an infantry corps. The great idea might have died right there, buried by jealous superiors and lost to history. His superiors were so irritated by his endless stream of memos that they tried to bury the idea and shipped him off to a lesser command. But the plan reached Hitler, and Hitler seized on it. Manstein had managed to get himself in front of the Führer and laid the whole daring vision out in person. What followed, in May 1940, was one of the most stunning victories in modern history. The panzers burst out of the Ardennes at Sedan, exactly where the French least expected them. German engineers threaded thousands of vehicles along the narrow forest tracks in a traffic jam that stretched back 100 miles, and the enemy never saw it coming. At Sedan, the panzers forced their way across the Meuse River, and the French front simply came apart. The plan even earned a nickname that captured its shape: the sickle cut, slicing in behind the enemy and pinning him against the sea. While the Allies rushed north to meet a decoy attack in Belgium, the German armor raced for the sea behind them, cutting their finest armies off. The mighty French army, the largest in Europe, collapsed in just 6 weeks. Whole Allied armies were trapped against the sea at Dunkirk and barely escaped across the Channel. By a miracle, France signed its surrender in the very same railway carriage where Germany had been forced to surrender in 1918. For the Germans, it was the sweetest revenge imaginable. The humiliation of 1918 turned exactly on its head. A war the Kaiser's armies could not win in 4 long years. Manstein's plan had won in 40 days. That victory made Manstein famous. It also convinced Hitler, once and for all, that bold armored strokes could work miracles, a lesson the Führer would soon carry east into Russia. It was a defeat that stunned the world, and it had been born inside the mind of one man. When Hitler turned east and invaded the Soviet Union, Manstein went with him. Manstein led a panzer corps on a lightning drive toward Leningrad, covering staggering distances in a matter of days. His tanks plunged nearly 50 miles behind Soviet lines in 4 days, with a boldness that stunned even his own commanders. This was a new kind of war, on a scale the world had never witnessed, a front stretching over 1,000 miles, swallowing whole armies in its vast distances. Then he was handed an army of his own and sent to conquer the Crimea. After a long and brutal siege, he took the great fortress city of Sevastopol. To crack its defenses, the Germans hauled in some of the largest siege guns ever built, monsters that hurled shells the size of small cars. Earlier that year, he had trapped and destroyed an entire Soviet army on the Kerch Peninsula, a lightning victory that cleared the road to the great fortress. The conquest of the Crimea had taken the better part of a year of savage fighting across a peninsula of mountains, marshes, and fortresses. For that triumph, Hitler made him a field marshal, the very highest rank the German army could bestow. Manstein now stood at the absolute peak of his profession, his reputation towering above almost all his peers. He was famous for his icy calm in a crisis, working problems on the map while other men panicked around him. Even his enemies would come to respect him. To this day, a great many military professionals rank him the ablest field commander Germany produced in the entire war. Then came Stalingrad, when an entire German army was surrounded and trapped in that ruined city. It was Manstein who was ordered to smash through and rescue it. Manstein drove to within 30 miles of the starving men and could get no closer. The relief failed. The army in Stalingrad was doomed. Here, for the very first time, the war revealed the flaw that would one day doom Germany. To be saved, the trapped army had needed to break out and fight its way toward Manstein's tanks. But Hitler forbade any breakout, not one step back. Hold the city. So the German 6th Army stayed put and slowly died. 250,000 men, sacrificed to a single word: hold. Manstein had watched, powerless, as a word from Hitler condemned an entire army. And it would not be the last time. In its wake, the entire southern front began to fall apart. This was the crisis we opened on. The Red Army, drunk on victory, surged forward, overreaching, outrunning its own supplies in its hunger to finish the Germans off. And Manstein, coldly and patiently, waited for exactly that. He surrendered ground on purpose, letting the Soviet spearheads race far ahead of their fuel and their reserve. It was a terrifying gamble, and it took all of Manstein's authority to talk a nervous Hitler into allowing it. Give up cities now, he argued. in order to win a crushing victory just a few weeks later. Then he struck. His backhand blow crashed into the exposed Soviet flank and tore 3 whole armies to pieces. Kharkov fell back into German hands, and the shattered front slammed shut. It was a masterclass, a weaker force destroying a far stronger one through nothing but timing and maneuver. For one brief, shining moment, it looked as though Manstein alone might hold the entire Eastern Front together. Notice carefully what Manstein's genius depended on. His entire method was built on movement, on the freedom to retreat, to bend, to trade space for the chance to strike back. And that freedom was about to vanish, because the man Manstein served had come to believe in one idea above all others: never surrender a single foot of ground, hold everything, retreat from nothing. It was the exact opposite of everything that had made Manstein great. The finest maneuver commander of the war was being chained to a master who forbade maneuver. Again and again, Manstein pleaded with Hitler to change course. He begged him to appoint a single professional soldier to run the entire Eastern Front, and to give that man the freedom to maneuver. He was perhaps the only field marshal who dared to argue with the Führer as an equal, face to face. But Hitler would never surrender control of his war to anyone. Years later, in a memoir he pointedly titled Lost Victories, Manstein would insist Germany could have won in the East if only the Führer had listened to him. And so the greatest operational mind in Europe was left to fight with one hand tied behind his back. The German artist had proven he could beat the Red Army, even against impossible odds. But his hands were being tied and half a continent away. His true nemesis was rising, not a nobleman, not an artist, a peasant, forged in poverty and fire. Georgy Zhukov was born in 1896 in a mud-floored peasant hut in a village near Moscow. His family was desperately poor. As a boy, he was sent to the city to apprentice as a furrier, stitching animal skins for a living. There was nothing in his birth to hint that he would one day command millions and take Berlin. When the First World War came, he was conscripted into the Tsar's cavalry. Zhukov proved a natural brave to the point of recklessness, and twice decorated for valor. He was wounded in action, fighting the Germans near a city called Kharkov, the very place his great rival would one day craft his masterpiece. When the Russian Empire collapsed into revolution and civil war, Zhukov threw in his lot with the Bolsheviks and the new Red Army. He was everything Manstein was not: rough, blunt, self-made, and utterly without fear. Where Manstein rose through privilege and elite staff colleges, Zhukov clawed his way up from nothing, on courage and raw ability alone. In the years between the wars, he became one of the Red Army's first tank commanders, mastering the machine that would define the coming war. In the 1930s, that army was nearly destroyed not by any enemy, but by its own leader. Stalin's purges tore through the Soviet officer corps, and tens of thousands of commanders were shot or vanished into the camps. To be a gifted, ambitious officer in those years was to live in mortal danger. Somehow, Zhukov not only survived, he rose. Every promotion in those years was a step closer to the firing squad, and yet he kept on climbing. He learned a lesson Manstein would never have to face, that the man in the Kremlin could kill you as easily as any enemy. He came through a slaughter that devoured far better connected men, and it left him with a cold, clear understanding of the master he served. His moment came in 1939 on a remote border in Mongolia. There, the Japanese army was probing Soviet-held territory, testing whether the Red Army would actually fight. Zhukov was sent to give them their answer. What had begun as a border skirmish escalated into a full-blown war, with the Japanese pouring in tanks, aircraft, and tens of thousands of men. Zhukov massed his tanks in secret, deceived the enemy about his true strength, and then unleashed a lightning double envelopment. He swept around both Japanese flanks at once and sealed their army inside a pocket. The attack had opened as a straightforward frontal assault. Then his hidden armored brigade swung wide around each wing and slammed shut behind the enemy. Military historians compare it to Hannibal's masterpiece at Cannae, the dream of every commander who has ever lived. He had used tanks, aircraft, and artillery together in one coordinated hammer blow, precisely the kind of modern, combined warfare the Soviet Union would soon need to survive. This was the essence of what Soviet officers called deep battle, striking the enemy across his entire depth at once, and of Maskirovka, the art of deception that hit a blow until it was far too late to stop. The Japanese were crushed, and the victory sent ripples far beyond Mongolia. It helped convince Japan to turn away from Siberia and strike south instead down a road that would end at Pearl Harbor overnight. Zhukov was marked as the finest fighting general the Soviet Union possessed. It was the first of 4 times his country would name him a hero of the Soviet Union, a record no other commander could match. 2 years later, that reputation would be tested in the worst catastrophe his country had ever known. In June 1941, Hitler's army smashed into the Soviet Union, and the Red Army reeled backward in ruin. Entire armies were surrounded and destroyed. Millions of men were killed or captured in a matter of months. And whenever a crisis grew desperate enough, and Stalin reached for the same man again and again, Zhukov became the Soviet Union's firefighter flung to whichever point on the map was closest to collapse. In September 1941, he was rushed to Leningrad, where the Germans were tightening a noose around the city, and his ferocious defense helped keep it from falling. In the autumn of 1941, as German tanks came within sight of Moscow itself, it was Zhukov who took command of the capital's defense. Zhukov held the line through the worst of it, then launched a savage winter counterattack in temperatures of 30 degrees below zero. Fresh divisions rushed in from Siberia, hurled the frozen, exhausted Germans back from the gates of Moscow. These were hardened troops, freed from the Far East, once Zhukov's own victory at Khalkhin Gol had made a Japanese attack unlikely his triumph of 1939. Reaching forward to save Moscow in 1941, it was the first time in the entire war that Hitler's army had been decisively stopped. The myth of German invincibility had been broken, and Zhukov was the man who broke it. He had done it through a mixture of iron discipline and desperate improvisation, shooting deserters, feeding in every last reserve, holding the line by sheer force of will. A year later came the turning point of the entire war, as the German Sixth Army bled itself white in the streets of Stalingrad. Zhukov and his colleague Vasilevsky designed a trap of staggering scale. They would not fight the Germans head-on inside the city. For months, the city's defenders had clung to its ruins, fighting for every cellar and every factory, buying Zhukov the time he needed to spring his trap. Instead, they aimed their blow at the weak flanks guarding the German rear flanks held by tired Romanian and Hungarian troops. On the 19th of November, 1942, 2 massive Soviet pincers punched through those flanks and swung shut behind the city. More than 250,000 Axis soldiers were suddenly trapped, cut off, with no way out. Through the freezing winter, that army starved, and in February 1943, it surrendered. It was the first time in history that a German field marshal had ever been taken prisoner. The man who surrendered, Friedrich Paulus, had been made a field marshal only days before Hitler's grim hint that he should die rather than give up. He surrendered anyway. Stalingrad shattered the German war machine in the east, and it turned Georgy Zhukov into a legend. So here we arrive at the real question. If Manstein was the greater artist of war, and many who study it believe he was, then how exactly did Zhukov beat him? The answer is the beating heart of this entire story. Zhukov did not defeat Manstein by outthinking him over a map. He defeated him because he held 2 things that Manstein, for all his genius, never would. The first was freedom. Early in the war, Stalin had been a disaster as a commander, meddling, forbidding retreats, feeding whole armies into encirclement. His own no-retreat orders had cost the Soviet Union a fortune in blood. But Stalin learned, after the catastrophes of 1941, he did something Hitler could never bring himself to do. He began, slowly, to trust his generals. Stalin made Zhukov his deputy second only to himself, and increasingly let his professionals fight the war their own way. As a signal of that trust, the political officers who had shadowed every commander were stripped of their power. Stalin had learned to unleash his best general. Hitler was busy doing the exact opposite. As the war turned against him, the Führer trusted his generals less and less, and gripped the map tighter and tighter. Hitler forbade the retreats, overruled his own experts, and scattered his forces, trying to defend everything at once. One dictator was learning to let his finest commander off the leash. The other was busy shortening it, and that was the difference that would decide everything. Think about what that meant in practice. When disaster struck, Zhukov could retreat, regroup, and counterattack on his own judgment. When disaster struck Manstein, he had to telephone a Führer hundreds of miles away and beg for a permission that often came too late or never came at all. One general fought only the war in front of him. The other fought two wars at once, one against the Red Army, and one against his own commander-in-chief. The second thing Zhukov possessed was the machine. Behind him stood the awakened industrial might of the Soviet Union. Entire factories had been lifted up and hauled east, beyond the Ural Mountains, safe from German bombs. There, they poured out tanks, guns, and shells in numbers Germany could not begin to match. Behind the machine stood the men, a reservoir of soldiers that seemed to have no bottom. Where Manstein had to count every single division, Zhukov could absorb losses that would have destroyed any other army and keep on attacking. Now put those two forces together, near total freedom to command and near limitless resources to command with. That was the weapon Manstein's brilliance was hurled against. In truth, the two men had already been circling one another for months. When Manstein's backhand blow retook Kharkov in the spring of 1943, it was Zhukov who was sent south to steady the shattered Soviet front against him. He rushed in to organize the defenses directly in Manstein's path, the first time these two titans had ever been set face to face. That first clash went to the German. Zhukov, who though was a fast learner, and the rematch would be fought on his terms. The two of them collided. At last, in the summer of 1943, after his triumph at Kharkov, Manstein wanted to strike one more time while he still could. The target was a great bulge in the Soviet line around the city of Kursk. But this time, Zhukov saw him coming. The Russian's instinct told him exactly where the German blow would fall, and he prepared a trap of his own. Instead of massing to attack, Zhukov ordered his men to dig. They built defenses of almost unimaginable depth. Belt after belt of trenches, minefields, and anti-tank guns. Hundreds of miles deep, Zhukov gathered thousands of tanks and thousands of guns. And then he waited. When Manstein's panzers finally attacked, in July 1943, they drove straight into the deadliest killing ground ever prepared. The result was the largest tank battle in the history of the war. Near a village called Prokhorovka, hundreds of tanks collided in a single swirling brawl, steel grinding against steel at point-blank range. The German armor smashed itself against that wall of steel and bled. Manstein's men fought brilliantly, and they pushed deep, but they could not break through. His thrust came closer than any other to cracking the Soviet line, and for a moment, he let himself believe he could still win. Yet the reserves waiting behind Zhukov's defenses were bottomless, and every mile Manstein advanced only carried him deeper into the trap. The offensive ground to a halt, and the last great German attack in the east was finished. From that moment on, the German army in Russia would do only one thing: retreat. Notice, again, how the genius was beaten, not outmaneuvered, not outthought. He was worn down by depth, by resources, and by a commander who had finally been handed the freedom to fight a patient, crushing war. The artist had finally met a force his art could not overcome. So, who was the better general? Let's weigh them honestly, the way history has to one measure at a time. Start with the raw art of command, the power to look at a battlefield and conjure a way to win against the odds. Here, the honest answer favors the man who lost. Manstein's Sickles-Schnitt plan brought down France in 6 weeks. His backhand blow destroyed 3 armies while badly outnumbered. For sheer operational genius, most military professionals give the edge to the Germano. But let's be fair to Zhukov. This was no mere butcher, hurling bodies blindly at the enemy. His encirclement at Khalkhin-Gol, his trap at Stalingrad, his defense at Kursk, these were works of real skill, studied in their own right. The gap between the two men was far narrower than the old legend of the Crude. Plodding Russian would suggest both were masters of their craft. The difference between them was never really about the size of their talent. And to be honest about Zhukov, we must also be honest about his failures. His own Great Winter Offensive near Moscow in 1942, codenamed Mars, was a bloody catastrophe that his admirers spent years trying to forget. Some of his fellow marshals grumbled. Hunt, too, that he claimed more credit than he was owed, and history still argues over how much of each victory was truly his. But genius is not the same thing as victory. A commander is only as effective as the freedom and the resources he is actually given, and on that score, it was never close. Zhukov was handed the trust of his dictator and the full weight of a superpower's industry. Manstein was handed a Führer who tied his hands, overruled his judgment, and finally dismissed him altogether. Give Manstein the freedom and the resources that Zhukov enjoyed, and the war in the East might have looked very different indeed, but he never had them. And that, in the end, is the whole point. The better artist lost, because the better artist was never allowed to paint. Talent set the ceiling on what each man might achieve. Freedom decided how much of it he ever reached. Their contest was not decided by talent. It was decided by the men each of them served. Yet before we crown either of these commanders, we have to look hard at what their war actually cost. Because the Eastern Front was not just another battlefield. It was the deadliest place in the entire history of the human race. Here, two of the most murderous regimes on Earth threw their peoples at each other with almost unimaginable savagery. The Soviet Union alone lost around 27 million people, soldiers and civilians together. Whole cities were starved. Whole populations were massacred. The German invaders came not merely to conquer, but to enslave and to exterminate. Behind the front lines, the Nazis murdered millions of Jews, prisoners of war, and civilians in the largest campaign of killing the world has ever seen. By the war's end, the great majority of German soldiers who died in the entire conflict had died here. In the East, fighting the Soviets, both of these brilliant generals had blood on their hands. Zhukov won his victories with a ruthlessness that is hard even to comprehend. Zhukov spent the lives of his own soldiers like small change, sending them forward in waves, ordering penal troops to clear minefields with their own bodies. Victory, whatever the cost in lives, that was the Soviet way of war. And Zhukov was its master after the war. When Zhukov calmly explained to Eisenhower how he cleared German minefields by simply marching his infantry straight through them, the American general was left speechless with horror. Manstein's hands were dirtier still. In a far darker way, behind his brilliant armies came the SS death squads, and Manstein's forces cooperated with them. Prisoners were left to starve, villages were burned, and the men Manstein commanded either stood by or took part. He issued an order to his troops describing the extermination of the Jewish people as a necessity, words that made him complicit in genocide. The image of the clean German soldier fighting an honorable war while the Nazis did their killing elsewhere is a myth. Manstein helped invent that myth after the war to save his own name. It was a lie. These were not simple heroes. They were brilliant, deeply flawed men, serving monstrous masters. After Kursk, Manstein fought the campaign he had always dreaded, a long, bitter retreat across Ukraine, trading ground for the survival of his armies. Again and again, he pulled his men out of encirclements that should have destroyed them, in a fighting withdrawal that soldiers still study to this day. But every yard he surrendered drove Hitler into a deeper rage. The Führer demanded fortresses held to the last man. Manstein demanded the freedom to keep his armies alive. The two of them were now locked in an argument that could end in only one way. It was the very same disease that had doomed the men at Stalingrad, a Führer who would sooner lose an army than give up a town. Which brings us, at last, to the moment the artists' war came to an end. By the spring of 1944, the German front in the south was crumbling, and Manstein kept doing the one thing that made military sense, retreating to save his armies, so he could strike back later. Yet every retreat enraged Hitler, who demanded that every position be held to the last man. On the 30th of March, 1944, Hitler summoned him one final time. In the very same meeting, the Führer pinned a medal on his chest for his achievements and relieved him of his command. The finest field marshal in the German army was dismissed, and it was dressed up as medical leave. Hitler blamed his defeats on the very generals who had warned him And Manstein, the man who had won him his greatest victories, was cast aside. Manstein would never command troops again. The war still had more than a year to run, and Germany's most gifted general spent all of it on the sidelines, watching his country burn. It stands as one of history's great what-ifs, a genius, benched for the crime of wanting to fight his own way. And what became of the two men when the guns finally fell silent? Zhukov reached the very summit. In the spring of 1945, his army stormed into Berlin itself. It was Georgy Zhukov, the peasant's son, who accepted the final surrender of Nazi Germany. The furrier's apprentice from a mud-floored hut had taken the surrender of the Third Reich. Along the way, he had commanded the colossal offensives that broke the German army for good, smashing Army Group Center in the summer of 1944. Then driving across Poland to the gates of Berlin, the final road into Berlin ran through the fortified heights at Seelow, where his own men paid a terrible price to force the gate open. Zhukov had beaten the most feared army in the world, and he stood at the very pinnacle of Soviet glory. And then his own master turned on him. Stalin, jealous and afraid of Zhukov's enormous fame, stripped him of his commands and exiled him to obscure, distant posts. The man who had saved the Soviet Union was made to disappear, watched by the secret police, packing a suitcase in case they came to arrest him in the night. The parallel is almost too neat to believe. Two dictators, two of the finest soldiers of their age, and both commanders cast down the very moment they were no longer needed. In the end, both of these titans were discarded by the very tyrants they had served so well. One dictator chained his best general and then fired him. The other unleashed his and then feared him and buried him. Genius. It turned out, was the easy part. Being allowed to use it was everything. Manstein, for his part, was tried by the Allies and convicted of war crimes. It was a British court in 1949, and it heard how his forces had aided the massacre of civilians and worked alongside the killing squads. Yet by then the Cold War had begun, and the West wanted German soldiers on its side, not rotting away in its prisons. Manstein served only a few years in prison, was released, and lived out his days as a respected old soldier. The myth of his clean war largely intact. He even helped advise the new West German army, his brilliance as a soldier carefully separated, in the public mind, from the crimes he had signed his name to. So we come back to where we began, a field marshal bent over a map in the snow, at the very height of his genius, 1 year from disgrace. Erich von Manstein may well have been the finest military mind of the Second World War, and he lost to a man who was, perhaps, not quite his equal in pure talent, but who held the two things that talent alone can never buy: freedom and the machine. Historians have argued ever since about what Manstein might have done if Hitler had simply left him alone. Some believe he could have fought the Red Army to a bloody standstill in the East. Others insist that against Zhukov's endless men and inexhaustible machines, even the finest genius was doomed from the very start. Which leaves us with the question history has never truly settled. Who was the better general, the artist who was never allowed to win, or the force of nature who was? And does raw brilliance really matter? If the man above you will not let you use it, the battlefield never gave us a clean answer. Maybe only you can. Tell me what you think in the comments. I'll be reading every single one.
Thanks for staying until the end. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more. Your support is incredibly valuable to us and helps this channel grow.